The fluorescent lights of the Los Angeles courthouse hummed with their usual indifference, casting a sterile glow over the crowded hallway where dozens of plaintiffs and defendants waited for their moment before television's most feared judge. Among them stood Karen Mitchell, a woman whose perfectly coiffed blonde hair and designer handbag screamed entitlement louder than any words could. Her arms were crossed over her chest, her chin tilted upward at an angle that suggested she believed the world owed her something, and her lips curved into a smirk that spoke of absolute certainty. She was here to collect $5,000 from a restaurant manager who had dared to embarrass her, and in her mind, it was already a done deal. What Karen didn't know, what she couldn't possibly have imagined as she stood there rehearsing her fake tears and practiced victim voice, was that in less than 30 minutes, her own words would be read aloud in that courtroom, words she had typed gleefully on Facebook just hours after the incident she claimed had traumatized her. Words like easiest money I'll ever make and just have to cry on TV and say I'm traumatized LMAO. Words that would transform her from confident plaintiff to viral laughingstock in the span of a single court session. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Let's rewind to how Karen Mitchell, a 42-year-old self-proclaimed consumer advocate, with a history of complaints longer than a CVS receipt, came to stand before Judge Judith Scheindlin with what she believed was an unbeatable case. Before we dive into this incredible case, tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I love seeing where my viewers are around the world. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss more unbelievable cases like this one. Now, sit back, relax, and enjoy the video. Karen had spent years perfecting the art of getting what she wanted through sheer force of aggression and entitlement. In her neighborhood of Sherman Oaks, she was legendary, though not in the way she imagined. Store managers knew her by name and groaned when she walked through their doors. Restaurant staff drew straws to avoid serving her table. Customer service representatives recognized her voice on the phone and braced themselves for the inevitable tirade. She had mastered the complaint, the demand for managers, the threat of social media exposure, and most lucratively, the legal threat. Small businesses had learned it was often cheaper to give her a refund or a gift card than to deal with her relentless harassment. She collected these small victories like trophies, posting about each one on Facebook to her 3,000 friends, most of whom had never actually met her but enjoyed the drama she provided in their feeds. Her profile was a masterclass in manufactured outrage, a daily chronicle of perceived slights and triumphant, standing up for myself, moments that painted her as a crusader for consumer rights rather than what she actually was, a bully who had found a system she could exploit. The incident that brought her to Judge Judy's courtroom had occurred 3 months earlier at Casa Italiano, a family-owned restaurant in Baton Rouge that had been serving authentic Italian cuisine for over 15 years. Karen had arrived on a busy Saturday evening without a reservation, immediately irritated that she had to wait 10 minutes for a table despite the clearly packed dining room. When she was finally seated, she spent the first 5 minutes complaining about the table's location. It was too close to the kitchen, too far from the window, too near another party, too visible to the street. The young waitress who had the misfortune of serving her that night was Sarah Chen, a 22-year-old college student working her way through her final year at LSU. Sarah had encountered difficult customers before, it came with the territory, but she had never experienced anything quite like Karen Mitchell. From the moment she approached the table, Karen's demeanor was hostile, snapping her fingers to get Sarah's attention, speaking to her in the tone one might use with a particularly slow child, and making it clear that she expected perfection while simultaneously ensuring that perfection would be impossible to achieve. The evening had spiraled from there in a predictable pattern of escalating demands and returned dishes. The bread was too cold, then too warm. The water had too much ice, then not enough. The wine was poured incorrectly, the salad dressing was on the wrong side of the plate, and the ambient temperature of the dining room was somehow simultaneously too hot and too cold. But the real trouble began with the salmon special, a beautifully prepared Atlantic salmon with a lemon butter sauce that was the chef's pride and joy. Karen ordered it medium rare, then sent it back claiming it was overcooked. The chef prepared another, this time cooked slightly less, and Karen sent it back claiming it was now undercooked. A third salmon was prepared, and before she had even cut into it, Karen declared it obviously wrong and demanded something else entirely. This pattern continued for 47 minutes, during which Karen consumed 2 full bottles of wine, multiple appetizers, and 3 different desserts, all while maintaining a running commentary on the restaurant's failures that was loud enough to disturb every nearby table. Other diners began requesting to be moved. A couple celebrating their anniversary had their romantic evening completely derailed by the spectacle. And through it all, Sarah maintained her professionalism. Even as her hands shook and her eyes welled with tears, she refused to let fall in front of this woman who seemed to take pleasure in her distress. Finally, when Karen demanded to see the manager for the 7th time that evening, Marcus Johnson emerged from the kitchen where he had been watching the entire scene unfold on the security cameras. Marcus was a man who had worked in the service industry for 15 years, starting as a dishwasher at 16 and working his way up through sheer determination and an unwavering commitment to hospitality. He had dealt with difficult customers before, had developed the patience of a saint and the diplomatic skills of a career negotiator. But he had also developed something else over those years, a spine of steel when it came to protecting his staff from abuse. He approached Karen's table with a calm smile, his voice measured and professional, and asked how he could help resolve the situation. Karen, emboldened by wine and an audience of uncomfortable diners, launched into a loud tirade about the restaurant's incompetence, Sarah's inadequacy, and her own suffering at the hands of such unprofessional establishment. She demanded her entire meal be comped, threatened to destroy the restaurant on Yelp and Facebook, and implied legal action if her demands weren't met immediately. Marcus listened without interruption, his expression neutral, until she finally paused for breath. Then, in a voice that carried authority without rising in volume, he said 6 words that would change both their lives. "Ma'am, I need you to leave." The restaurant went silent. Karen's face cycled through shock, disbelief, and finally, rage. She stood up so quickly her chair tipped backward, pointed a perfectly manicured finger in Marcus's face, and unleashed a stream of threats and insults that would have made a sailor blush. She was going to sue. She was going to own this restaurant. She was going to make sure he never worked in this industry again. Marcus remained calm, simply gesturing toward the exit and repeating his request that she leave the premises. When Karen refused, instead escalating her volume and her threats, Marcus pulled out his phone and began dialing. "I'm calling the police to escort you out for trespassing," he said quietly. That's when Karen grabbed her designer purse, threw her cloth napkin directly at Marcus's face, and stormed toward the exit, pausing only to knock over a display of wine bottles near the door, sending 3 bottles of expensive Chianti crashing to the floor. As she burst through the door into the night, she turned back and screamed one final threat. "You're going to regret this. I'm going to take everything you have." Then she was gone, leaving behind a restaurant full of shell-shocked diners, a crying waitress in the bathroom, and a manager who immediately began documenting everything that had just happened, because he knew, with absolute certainty, that this was not over. Karen drove home in a fury, her mind already spinning with plans for revenge. But somewhere between the restaurant and her house, the fury transformed into something else entirely, calculation. She had been threatening lawsuits for years, using them as leverage to get free meals and refunds, but she had never actually followed through. The threats were usually enough. But this was different. This man had humiliated her, had thrown her out in front of all those people, had treated her like she was the problem when clearly the restaurant was at fault. And then it hit her, the idea that would lead her to this courthouse hallway 3 months later. What if she actually sued? Not in real court with real lawyers and real costs, but on television, on Judge Judy, where the show paid the judgment and all she had to do was show up and tell her story. She had watched enough episodes to know the formula: come in as the victim, cry a little, talk about your suffering, and walk out with a check. It was perfect. It was, as she would later post on Facebook in words that would destroy her, the easiest money she would ever make. By the time she pulled into her driveway, Karen Mitchell had transformed from an angry customer into a woman with a plan, and she was absolutely certain it would work. The plan that Karen constructed over the following weeks was built on a foundation of complete confidence in her own cleverness and a fundamental misunderstanding of how actual justice works. She had spent years in an echo chamber of her own creation, surrounded by Facebook friends who validated her every complaint and cheered her on through each manufactured crisis. In her world, being loud meant being right, and threatening legal action meant automatic victory. She had never actually been challenged in any meaningful way, had never faced consequences for her behavior, because it was always easier for businesses to give her what she wanted than to fight back. The system had trained her to be exactly what she was, and now she was about to discover what happened when the system finally said no. But first, she had to build her case, and in typical Karen fashion, she approached this task with the same combination of cunning and stupidity that had defined her entire adult life. She started by crafting her story, workshopping it with her best friend Brenda over multiple bottles of wine and increasingly elaborate versions of what had actually happened that night at Casa Italiano. Brenda Wallace was Karen's perfect complement, another entitled woman in her early 40s who had never been told no by anyone who mattered in her life. They had met in a Facebook group called Consumer Warriors, where people shared stories of successful complaints and strategies for getting refunds, and they had bonded immediately over their shared belief that the world was constantly trying to cheat them and their noble mission was to fight back. Brenda had never actually been present at the restaurant that night, a minor detail that bothered neither of them, but she had heard Karen's version of events so many times that she could recite it like scripture. In Karen's telling, which evolved and expanded with each retelling, she had been a perfectly polite customer who had simply wanted a decent meal. The waitress had been incompetent and rude, possibly racist, though Karen couldn't quite decide what race she was being discriminated against for. The food had been genuinely inedible, possibly even spoiled, and when she had politely asked to speak with the manager, he had stormed over like a madman and screamed at her to get out in front of the entire restaurant. She had been so traumatized, so utterly destroyed by this public humiliation, that she had barely been able to drive home. She had nightmares about it. She couldn't eat at restaurants anymore. She needed therapy, medication, justice. The actual filing of the lawsuit was easier than Karen had imagined. Judge Judy's producers were always looking for compelling cases, and a woman claiming severe emotional distress from being kicked out of a restaurant had the kind of dramatic potential they loved. Karen filled out the application with her well-rehearsed story, carefully omitting any details that might make her look bad, and waited. When the call came 3 weeks later informing her that her case had been selected and asking if she could be in Los Angeles in 2 weeks, she actually screamed with joy. She immediately called Brenda, who agreed without hesitation to come along as her witness and moral support. They spent the next 2 weeks preparing like they were planning a heist, going over the story again and again, practicing Karen's crying face in the mirror, selecting the perfect outfit that said, "traumatized victim," while still maintaining her sense of style. Karen even went so far as to visit a therapist twice, not because she actually needed therapy, but because she wanted a legitimate receipt she could wave around in court as proof of her suffering. The therapist, a kind woman named Dr. Patricia Morrison, spent both sessions trying to understand why Karen seemed so cheerful and excited about an incident she claimed had devastated her, but Karen was paying cash and the therapist had bills to pay, so she provided the receipt without asking too many questions. What Karen didn't know, what she was constitutionally incapable of understanding, was that Marcus Johnson had been preparing too. Unlike Karen, whose preparation consisted of crafting lies and practicing performances, Marcus had spent the last 3 months building an ironclad case based entirely on truth. From the moment Karen had stormed out of his restaurant, he had known this wasn't over. He had worked in the service industry long enough to recognize a professional complainer when he saw one, and something about the calculated nature of her final threat had set off alarm bells in his head. So he had done what any smart business owner would do in the age of litigation: he had documented everything. The security footage from that night had been immediately backed up to 3 separate drives. Every staff member who had witnessed the incident had written detailed statements while their memories were fresh. He had pulled the receipts showing exactly what Karen had ordered and consumed. He had collected written statements from 4 other diners who had been disturbed by her behavior, including the anniversary couple whose evening she had ruined. And when Karen's lawsuit arrived at his restaurant 2 weeks later, he had taken it straight to a lawyer who had looked at his evidence and smiled. Marcus Johnson was not a man who sought conflict, but neither was he someone who backed down when he knew he was right. At 34, he had worked harder than most people twice his age, building a career through dedication and integrity in an industry that chewed up and spit out the unprepared. He had started washing dishes at his uncle's restaurant when he was 16, saving every penny to help his single mother pay the bills. By 18, he was working front of house, learning the delicate dance of customer service. By 25, he had managed 3 different restaurants, earning a reputation for turning around struggling establishments through better training and genuine care for both staff and customers. Casa Italiano had hired him 2 years ago specifically because of that reputation, and he had transformed it from a struggling family business into one of Baton Rouge's most beloved dining spots. He had done it by creating a culture of respect for the food, respect for the customers, and most importantly, respect for the staff who made it all possible. So when Karen Mitchell had verbally abused one of his waitresses and then tried to weaponize the legal system against him, it wasn't just about defending himself, it was about defending every service worker who had ever been treated like garbage by someone who thought their money made them royalty. Sarah Chen, the waitress who had served Karen that night, had been hesitant to get involved in the lawsuit at first. She was a quiet person by nature, someone who preferred to avoid conflict and just get through her shifts so she could focus on her studies. But as the weeks passed and she learned more about what Karen was claiming, about how she was painting herself as the victim while Sarah was being portrayed as incompetent and rude, something hardened inside her. She had worked at Casa Italiano for 2 years, putting herself through college one table at a time, and she was good at her job. She had regular customers who requested her section. She had received commendations from management. She had never, not once, deserved to be treated the way Karen had treated her that night. The memory of hiding in the bathroom, crying while another server rubbed her back and told her it wasn't her fault, still burned with shame. Not because she had done anything wrong, but because she had let someone make her feel small. When Marcus asked if she would be willing to testify, to come to Los Angeles and tell the truth about what had happened, she had said yes without hesitation. This wasn't just about defending Marcus or the restaurant anymore, it was about standing up to the kind of person who had made her life miserable and finally saying enough. The contrast between the two parties as they prepared for their day in court could not have been more stark. On one side was Karen, treating the whole thing like a game, posting constantly on Facebook about her upcoming TV appearance, coaching Brenda on what to say, shopping for the perfect "I'm a victim" outfit, and genuinely believing that her ability to lie convincingly would be enough to fool a woman who had been a judge for decades. Her Facebook posts from this period would later become evidence, but in the moment, she saw no danger in publicly discussing her strategy. She posted photos of herself practicing her sad face with the caption, "Getting ready for my close-up." She posted a poll asking her friends whether she should claim anxiety or depression or both. She live-streamed herself and Brenda doing a mock trial in her living room, laughing hysterically as Brenda pretended to be Judge Judy and Karen pretended to cry. Every post, every comment, every reaction was public, visible to anyone who cared to look, including Marcus's lawyer who was carefully screenshotting and documenting each one, building a secondary case that Karen was handing him on a silver platter. On the other side was Marcus, quietly gathering facts and preparing to let the truth speak for itself. He had spent hours with his lawyer going over every detail, not to craft a story, but to make sure he could present the reality of what had happened in the clearest possible way. He had organized his evidence into a folder so thorough it would make a prosecutor jealous, security footage with timestamps, receipts with itemized orders, witness statements with contact information for verification, even Sarah's text messages from that night showing her distress in real time. His lawyer had wanted to countersue for the unpaid bill and defamation, but Marcus had declined. He didn't want money from Karen Mitchell, he wanted something far more valuable. He wanted her to face the consequences of her actions in front of an audience of millions, to have her lies exposed so completely that she could never pull this stunt again, not just against him, but against any service worker anywhere. He wanted accountability in a world that seemed to have forgotten what that word meant. And he was about to get it in ways that would exceed even his most optimistic expectations, because what neither Karen nor Marcus knew yet was that Judge Judith Scheindlin had already reviewed the case files, had already seen the evidence from both sides, and had already made up her mind about exactly how this was going to go. The courtroom doors opened and Karen Mitchell strode in like she owned the place, designer heels clicking against polished floors, her carefully rehearsed victim expression already in place. The studio was smaller than she expected, more intimate, which meant every lie would echo louder. Marcus stood at the defendant's podium, calm and prepared, his evidence folder thick with truth. The bailiff announced Judge Judy's entrance, and everyone rose. Judge Scheindlin swept in, her presence filling the room instantly, those sharp eyes already assessing, already knowing. She took her seat, looked directly at Karen, and said 5 words that should have been a warning, "All right, Ms. Mitchell, convince me." Karen smiled, completely unaware she was already doomed. Karen cleared her throat dramatically, dabbed at her completely dry eyes with the tissue she had been clutching since she walked in, and launched into the performance she had rehearsed for 2 weeks straight. "Your Honor, I went to Casa Italiano on March 15 just wanting a nice, quiet dinner. I had been having a difficult week at work, and I just needed some peace." Her voice carried the practiced tremor of someone who had watched too many Lifetime movies and thought they understood trauma. "From the moment I sat down, the service was terrible. The waitress, Sarah, was rude and dismissive. I politely asked for my salmon to be cooked properly, and she rolled her eyes at me." The lie came out smooth as silk, and Karen almost believed it herself at this point, having told the story so many times that the fiction had replaced the reality in her own mind. "When I asked to speak with the manager, this man," she pointed at Marcus with theatrical accusation, "came storming over and started screaming at me in front of everyone. He told me to get out, called me names, humiliated me in front of dozens of people." Her voice rose with manufactured indignation, and she pressed the tissue to her eyes again, this time adding a small shoulder shake for effect. "I have never been so embarrassed in my entire life, Your Honor. I ran out of there in tears. I couldn't eat for days. I had to start seeing a therapist because of nightmares about being yelled at in public." She reached into her designer purse and pulled out a folded piece of paper with all the ceremony of someone presenting the Declaration of Independence. "I have the therapy bills right here. $2,000 so far, and I'm still not recovered. I can't go to restaurants anymore without having panic attacks." Judge Judy leaned back in her chair, her expression unreadable, letting Karen dig her hole deeper with every word. Judge Judy let the silence hang in the air for a long moment, her eyes never leaving Karen's face, watching as the plaintiff shifted her weight from foot to foot, clearly expecting validation or sympathy or at minimum some acknowledgement of her suffering. Instead, Judge Judy turned her attention to Marcus with the kind of look that suggested she had already made up her mind about something, and it wasn't good news for Karen. "Mr. Johnson, I'm assuming you have a different version of these events." Her tone was dry, almost bored, but there was an undercurrent of anticipation that anyone who had watched her show would recognize immediately. This was the calm before the storm, the moment when everything was about to shift. Marcus nodded respectfully and opened his folder with steady hands. "Your Honor, I do have a different version, because I have the actual version. With evidence." He pulled out the first document, a printed spreadsheet with highlighted sections. "This is Ms. Mitchell's complete order from that evening. She was at my restaurant for 47 minutes, not the hours she's claiming. In that time, she ordered 3 full entrees, 2 bottles of wine totaling $140, 4 different appetizers, and 3 desserts." Judge Judy's eyebrow arched. "And did she pay for any of this?" Marcus shook his head. "No, Your Honor. She claimed everything was inedible and refused to pay the bill, which totaled $287. Karen's face flushed red and she started to interrupt, but Judge Judy raised one finger without even looking at her, and Karen's mouth snapped shut like a puppet whose strings had been cut. "Continue, Mr. Johnson." Marcus pulled out his second piece of evidence, a USB drive. "I have security footage from that entire evening, Your Honor. It shows everything. Ms. Mitchell snapping her fingers at my waitress, sending back food she barely looked at, drinking both bottles of wine, speaking loud enough that other customers complained, and when I politely asked her to leave, she threw her napkin at my face and knocked over 3 bottles of wine on her way out, causing an additional $200 in damages. Judge Judy took the USB drive and handed it to her bailiff. "Let's see this footage." As the courtroom monitor flickered to life, Karen's confident expression began cracking like cheap porcelain. The timestamp in the corner of the screen read 6:47 p.m., and there she was, walking into Casa Italiano with the posture of someone already looking for a fight. The security footage played in damning silence, each timestamp a nail in Karen's coffin. There she was snapping her fingers at Sarah, her mouth clearly moving in what was obviously not polite conversation. There she was gesturing wildly at her plate, her face twisted in exaggerated disgust. There she was standing up, pointing aggressively at Marcus, her body language screaming aggression while his remained calm and professional. And there, in crystal clear high definition, was Karen throwing her napkin directly at Marcus's face before sweeping her arm across the wine display on her way out. The courtroom watched in stunned silence as the woman who had just claimed to be a traumatized victim was revealed to be exactly the opposite. When the footage ended, Judge Judy turned to Karen with an expression that could have frozen hell itself. "Ms. Mitchell, would you like to revise your testimony about who was screaming at whom?" Karen's mouth opened and closed like a fish drowning in air. "The camera angle, it doesn't show, you can't hear what he said to me." Her voice had lost all its practiced tremor and now just sounded desperate. Judge Judy held up her hand. "I can see everything I need to see. But Mr. Johnson, you said you had more." Marcus nodded, and this is when his expression shifted from professional to something that almost resembled satisfaction. "Yes, Your Honor. I have Ms. Mitchell's own words." He pulled out a stack of papers, each one a printed screenshot, and Karen's face went from red to white in an instant. She knew exactly what those papers were, and for the first time since walking into this courtroom, genuine fear flickered across her features. Marcus handed the first page to the bailiff who passed it to Judge Judy. "This is a Facebook post from Ms. Mitchell's public profile, posted at 8:47 p.m. on March 15, exactly 1 hour after she left my restaurant." Judge Judy put on her reading glasses, and the courtroom held its collective breath. "Let me read this out loud," Judge Judy said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "OMG, just had the worst experience at Casa Italiano, but it was so worth it." She looked up at Karen over her glasses. "Traumatized, were you?" Karen tried to speak but no words came out. Judge Judy continued reading. "That idiot manager actually thought he could kick me out. Little does he know I'm going to sue his ass and get paid. Already talked to a lawyer friend who says this is an easy $5,000. Easiest money I'll ever make." The courtroom erupted in gasps and murmurs. Judge Judy banged her gavel once, and silence returned instantly. "There's more," she said, flipping to the next screenshot. "All I have to do is cry on TV and say I'm traumatized LMAO." She removed her glasses slowly, deliberately, and stared at Karen with the kind of look that could make hardened criminals confess. "You came into my courtroom planning to commit fraud." Karen's legs were visibly shaking now. "Your Honor, it was just social media talk, I didn't mean, people exaggerate online all the time." Judge Judy cut her off with a single word. "Stop." The word cracked like a whip. "Mr. Johnson, tell me there's more." Marcus smiled, not smugly, but with the quiet satisfaction of a man who had prepared for war and brought superior weapons. "Yes, Your Honor." She posted 14 times that night, all celebrating her plan to defraud my restaurant. And this morning, before coming to court, she posted a photo in the parking lot with the caption, "Let's get this bread," and a money bag emoji. He handed over another screenshot showing Karen in that very outfit, flashing a peace sign with the caption clearly visible. Judge Judy looked at the image, then at Karen, then back at the image. "Ms. Mitchell, you're either the dumbest criminal I've ever seen, or you have so much contempt for this court that you thought I wouldn't check. Which is it?" Karen's mouth trembled, and this time the tears were real, tears of humiliation and dawning realization that she had destroyed herself with her own words. "I want to withdraw my case," she whispered. Judge Judy leaned forward. "Oh no, we're just getting started." Judge Judy removed her glasses with the deliberate precision of someone who had been waiting for this exact moment. "Ms. Mitchell, your case is dismissed. Not only are you not getting $5,000, you owe Mr. Johnson $287 for the bill you walked out on, plus $1,500 for his legal fees, plus $2,000 for court costs and his time. That's $3,787 total. You have 30 days. Karen's gasp was audible even over the gallery's murmurs. But Judge Judy wasn't finished. "Furthermore, I'm referring your case to the district attorney's office for attempted fraud and conspiracy to commit perjury." She turned to Brenda, who had been trying to melt into her seat. "And you, Ms. Wallace, you're being referred as well for conspiracy. You'll both be hearing from them." The gavel came down with finality that echoed like a gunshot. "Get out of my courtroom." The walk out of that courthouse was the longest of Karen's life. Camera crews were waiting, word having spread fast about the spectacular courtroom implosion. Her face was plastered across social media within an hour, her own Facebook post screenshot and shared millions of times with hashtags like Karen vs. Judge Judy and Instant Karma trending worldwide. Her 3,000 Facebook friends became 800 by that evening, then 400 by the next morning. Local restaurants circulated her photo with "Do Not Serve" warnings. Her employer called before she even made it home. Brenda sent a single text, "Lose my number." Karen arrived home to find herself viral for all the wrong reasons, every moment of her entitlement captured forever, her own words the evidence of her downfall. Marcus returned to Casa Italiano that night to a standing ovation from his staff. Sarah hugged him, tears of relief streaming down her face. "Thank you for standing up for us," she whispered. Marcus smiled. Bullies only win when good people do nothing. The restaurant's business doubled within a week, people wanting to support the establishment that had finally stood up to a Karen. Judge Judy's lesson echoed far beyond that courtroom, your own words will either vindicate you or bury you, and Karen Mitchell had dug her own grave one Facebook post at a time. In the age of social media, nothing disappears, and karma has a very long memory.